my name is Susan O'Connor. I'm the director of the Scottish Civic Trust, but in my previous life I used to be a construction project manager, and I did that for 20 years, working specifically on heritage buildings. So while I'm only in post as the director of the Scottish Civic Trust for a year, I have a lot of experience in this kind of work. And this is our publication, which you've all been referred to. If anybody can't get the download, let me know and I'll send you the PDF. We don't have hard copies anymore because who has hard copies of anything anymore? So sorry about that. So I'm going to talk to you this morning briefly because I know we're really wildly behind schedule, and as a project manager that really bugs me. So I'm gonna skip to the all killer no filler version of this presentation, which is without the sort of the fun sidetracks into case studies, but it's just about stuff I've learned over the years about this kind of work and how I think we should all be thinking about church buildings. I'm going to be talking about churches, but I mean churches and chapels because I know in Wales, as in Ireland indeed, there's a healthy mixture of the two, but church is just easier and quicker to say. So I'm going to talk, as I said, about buildings in Scotland, church buildings in Scotland, specifically around their reuse for non-ecumenical purposes. And I'm going to finish up with some hard-learned lessons of what to do and not to do to your church buildings. There is a question and answer session at the end. I will be around for lunch and then I will be skittering back off to Edinburgh, so catch me if you can, basically. Okay, so what is the future of churches? Who is going to be looking after churches? Hold on. Oh, that's not working. That way. Ah! No? Okay, fine. So, in Scotland, the Church of Scotland is going to be getting rid of 800 church buildings over the next 10 years, or so it thinks. If it can manage the titles, it's going to be getting rid of 800 church buildings over the next 10 years. So the question is, who is going to take on these church buildings? Because I'm pretty sure there aren't 800 new congregations all waiting for churches in the wings. Well, we have done quite a lot of work with local groups across Scotland, finding out who is looking at churches now and who's interested in them. And we did a workshop recently in Glasgow, and we discovered that 50% of the people in the audience were not of a church or faith background. And it's those 50% of the population who are really going to be the ones taking forward churches. And in Scotland we have something called community asset transfer, and we're seeing that an awful lot of those groups now are looking at church buildings. But why would you look at a church building? Well, I view churches very positively, even though I've done up an awful lot of them and they've always been a pain. At the end of it, there is that beautiful moment where you go, this is the most worthwhile thing I've ever done. But it's hard to get to that point from a starting stand when your rain pipes are leaking all over the place and you've got stone that's leaking crystals all over the front of it and you've got a congregation of 8. So I'm going to be a bit simplistic briefly and talk through why churches are great buildings. So, now, I know this is a bit naughty. This is, of course, Notre Dame. But this is, to me, is a really good example of a well-built building. Because even though there was this horrendous fire, only the crossing has been lost. The rest of that building can be reconstructed. So church buildings as a whole are always really well constructed because they were built as symbols of power and dominance. Okay, so the people who were building these had a lot of money to spare, and they spent it on the stonework and they spent it on the roofs, and the structure of these buildings is generally very good, and I have to say far superior than its modern equivalent. They're also really well located, and I really like this slide. This is in Brecon, and if I were a community group, the building that I would really want to take on is St. Mary's here, St. Mary's Church, because if you can see St. Mary's Church, right in the centre of Brecon, or is it Brecon? Brecon, okay, good. There's the town hall there, very good walking distance. There's a tower here, which is interesting. There's another church over here. There's the cattle market over here, and there's the market hall here. St. Mary's is bang in the middle of all of those things. Now, you'll often find that church buildings are right in the centre of towns, and you cannot get an equivalent brownfield site that's of the same prominence. Really well located, these buildings. They're also really big. This is Wrexham, and this is the parish church in Wrexham, but you can see the difference in scale, which I think is really interesting. So you've got all your normal scale of buildings, and I know it's different today. This is a photograph is from the 1860s, I think. But even so, the scale of the building is completely different. And for a lot of small villages and towns, churches offer a much bigger building than anywhere else that's available. And finally, they're always really well located and recognisable. So right at the back of the town there, you can see that's the spire of St Mary's in Tenby. People are able to see these buildings from a distance. It is part of your mental map of the town. You already have goodwill imbued within that building just because people see it every day as they walk past it. They may never have been inside it, but they know what that building is. And if you're trying to start a new community use, it's incredibly useful to borrow that sort of sense of community ownership for your new use. There's a goodwill there that's really important. I had a project in Scotland for where a building had been run by National Museum Scotland as a costume museum for years and years and years, and it was really prominent in the town. But nobody had ever gotten inside it because it was used as a store facility. And when it came for the National Museums of Scotland to offload that building, the first thing we did was to open the doors. And we found that when we spoke to people, they already really liked the building, even though they'd never stepped foot inside those doors, because they'd seen it every day. And that's incredibly valuable if you're trying to set up a new structure and you're trying to get community buy-in. So never knock a church. They have a lot to offer. So I did say I was going to be all killer, no filler. So I'm going to skip through some of my case studies and just give you the headline bits from them. This is St Andrews in Lochgelly, which is up north, and this is a really interesting project because a lot of people would talk about church buildings and the issues with them around their volume being too big for anything. You cannot do anything in a church building because it's too big. Well, I would say, well, that's a fantastic climbing centre, frankly. And this is what they're doing in Lochgelly, which is sort of to the north-east of Scotland in Fife. So first of all, what they've done is they've done a wind and water tighting project, a sort of a making good project of 736,000. And what that's done is made the building dry for the first time in God knows how long. And I would always recommend making a building dry, first of all, and then taking a pause and thinking about what you want to do next. Because all sorts of things happen to church buildings when they're dry for the first time. Cracks appear randomly in places, particularly in plasterwork. Stonework will develop cryptofluorescence on the surface quite often as the salts start to leach out and sort of sit on their surface for longer. And they take a while. They smell differently after a while. But also, if you can afford to do a project in 2 phases, it gives you a moment to think about your next phase. When you're suddenly in the building, you go, actually, it's dry. It's actually quite nice to be in here before. So before you might have been thinking about uses that are very much about a quick turnover because nobody actually likes to sit in the space. But the feeling of a space can change dramatically when it's actually nice and dry. So they're just about to start in their second phase. So this is the before. And this is the after in the top left-hand corner and the visualization, in the bottom right of what it's going to look like in the end. And you'll see it's quite interesting that they've decided to take the tone of the woodwork up a bit to sort of make it feel much warmer. So what they're doing there is they're going to install the climbing walls in the main nave there and in the little addition to the side as well. And they have a little community interest company called Lochgelly, which is pretty great. And they're going to be starting to offer climbing facilities in Scotland. Climbing is a huge thing in Scotland. People like to do it outside, but like here, the weather doesn't always obey. And so having these kind of facilities is really, really quite a good use for a church because it makes use of all that space. It's not the only example. This is Grange Church in Kimarnock, which is a particularly nice one. They've recently completed their funding package, which was 2.4 million. And they're going to be starting work fairly soon on it. And they have part fundraised for that with a mobile climbing tower. I don't know if you've seen them. They have these mad big trucks, and the climbing tower comes in 2 pieces, and they put it together, and they bring it to events, and they get income. So they charge, I think it's £4.50 it was for my daughter to climb one of them. At one of these local events, and they make whatever 400 quid in an afternoon, but also they have all the details about the restoration and the proposed building on the actual climbing tower itself. So it's creating community awareness, it's making money, and it's potentially recruiting new trustees, because nothing is more useful for getting on board a new trustee than a really exciting activity. If you can get people doing something instead of sitting at a table, generally speaking, they will become much more engaged with your project. So that's a really good thing if you're thinking about a climbing centre. Try and get a mobile climbing tower. And this is Glasgow Climbing Centre in Ibrox. Another really interesting conversion in this way. You can see that you really can't see that much of the space, the original sort of churchy space left. But if you can see in the first photograph in the bottom left there, at the far end, there's a cafe. And it's an excellent cafe. And you can look out the stained glass window, and that's using the original balcony within the church to provide that facility. Really worthwhile thinking about that kind of thing. It creates an income, but it also provides a local facility, and so people come in and use the cafe who aren't actually climbing. But if you want to watch your child falling off a wall, and who doesn't really, that's a great place to do it from. And finally, this is Ailean Rock in Newhaven in Edinburgh. It's a good reuse of a church if you don't really want to see what's inside the church, because the walls here are completely all the way to the ceiling, as you can see, and you really can't see much of the church building. However, there is a plethora of churches down in Newhaven, and this was a good use because it brought in people who weren't otherwise going to be in Newhaven to the area, and actually there's a whole load of nice new cafes all around it, and there's a couple of really interesting outdoorsy equipment type of places, and I think Sustrans are putting in a cycle track because so many people are cycling down to the climbing centre. So there's lots of some nice add-ons. So while yes, you cannot see any of the church interior, it's become a really important part of the community. Okay, so I'm going to also talk about churches as venues. This is Cottiers in Glasgow. It looks fairly unassuming from the outside, apart from that magnificent spire. And this is what it used to look like on the left-hand side. In the 80s, that's what it looked like. And today, it kind of looks more like the one on the right-hand side. Now, that's a really, really long-term project, and I was going to give you all sorts of really interesting details about the refurb, but actually, we don't really have time for that. So, I'm just going to show you some more photographs. So, the building itself was by William Leaper, but the reason it's called Cottiers is because the design scheme was by a guy called Daniel Cottier, who you may or may not have heard of, but was a really big arts and crafts designer. You can see this beautiful, beautiful stenciling and gilding and stained glass all over the place. And so the refurbishment took 30 years, really, because the funding took ages and ages to get in place because of the level of work that was required. And I think in the left-hand photograph, you can see them where they've done the trial stenciling on the first bay there, and then on the right-hand, you can see where it's still the original. So an awful lot of work went into that, and a lot of different funding goals were set to do different parts of it. But they funded the majority of that through creating a basement restaurant and cafe, which I think I may have a photo. I do, yeah. So the top right there, believe it or not, that's the basement. And they did that as a sort of a fundraising thing, and they let out the main space also as a wedding venue. People really like it, and they've always really liked the fact that it's been unfinished, to the extent that now when it's in a more perfect state, I understand that bookings have trailed off a little bit because it doesn't have that sort of romantic falling down around your ears thing, which people quite like. But what has helped it is that cafe in the top right-hand corner. Not only has it provided an income stream, but it's kept the building dry and warm while they figured out how to fund the top bits. And that's incredibly useful as well. Now, it happens to be in a very wealthy part of Glasgow. There's a lot of people looking for a nice posh place to have their dinner, so it works well there. But what if you have a much smaller place, a chapel, for example, in the middle of nowhere? What do you do? Well, this is Braemar. St. Margaret's, Braemar, where Queen Victoria used to holiday. Built, let me see, it was built in 1899, which was a bit unfortunate given that Queen Victoria died 2 years later. And Braemar sort of fell out of common fashion as a holidaying retreat because she wasn't there anymore. But she was very fond of the Highlands anyway. So this was basically created to house the tourist worshippers, in effect. And unfortunately, because she died in 1901, ever since then there's been sort of a dwindling congregation until eventually a group of 6 people, I think 6 local people, came forward and said, okay, enough is enough, something has to be done. It's tiny. That's basically the size of it. You can see it there. So on the left-hand side there, you can see some of the images of the building as a church. And then in the bottom left, you can see it sort of stripped out with the stage in it. And they run all sorts of different venues because it turns out the building has really good acoustics. Really good acoustics. There are loads of other church halls in Braemar. It's full of churches. But none of them have got quite the same level of acoustics, and most of them have more elaborate interiors that don't lend themselves so well to kind of different uses. And it's gradually getting quite the reputation as a venue. So they do traditional music, they do rock concerts, they do basically anything in there. You can and they still use it for services as well, because they just take in and out the chairs. It's as simple as that. So that works really, really well. So that's your small venue. Or, of course, you've got the Phoebe Trequare amazing thing, which is actually in our leaflet, which is a fantastic building right in the centre of Edinburgh, and world-class venue, all of the kind of singing and dancing, much longer type of project as well. But realistically, Braemar is not a bad thing to aim for. They don't make an awful lot of money from it, but because there are no major interventions made to that building, they don't need to make an awful lot of money. What they need to be able to do is clean out the gutters and fix the roof and make sure the toilets are clean. And that is the right size of ambition for that building. And I'll do my rant about Millennium Domes at the end of this talk, but just bear that in mind. That works for that building. It doesn't need to be anything more. It's tiny. That purpose works really, really well. And finally, I'm going to talk about champing. Show of hands, who knows what champing is? Excellent. So I'm talking to the converted, more or less. So champing is a thing that happens in England where you get to stay in churches overnight. And it requires no interventions to the existing structures unless you don't have any toilets with your church, which some of you don't. But you can put in a portaloo. Portaloo is acceptable. And it requires quite a lot of maintenance in terms of being present to let people in. And some churches will give people breakfast the next morning. So the idea is, it's sold along the idea that you are camping indoors. And that way you get people's expectations at exactly the right level, because it doesn't have to be warm. It can be drafty, but it's not windy, and mostly it's dry. So people are already looking for that type of experience. What you're not selling is a bijou type of residence, because it just doesn't work like that. You don't want to disappoint people, but it's happening quite well. So at the moment there are 18 different churches across England where you can do it, and over 2,000 people did that last year. It's actually from a Scandinavian idea. The champing people will tell you that it's not, but it actually has Scandinavian roots, where if you went to a really remote part of sort of Norway or Sweden, the only building that would be free for you to stay in would have been a church, and so you would get put up in a church, and they still do it these days, and I don't think they charge quite the same rates as the champing people. But it has that roots about bedding people down in the community who are visitors, which I think is really interesting. But what you can see in those images, which I think is really nice, is the way that there's no alterations there. People are actually using the pews themselves to sleep in, which is quite good. And they will provide bedding as well, which they launder between visits. And I know you're all thinking, but how much do they charge? Well, it's about 50 quid per person at the weekend and 25 quid per child. Midweek it's 40 quid. And then I think it's the same for kids. So it's not insubstantial in terms of the amount of money that you can bring in. And it means minimum interventions, which I think is really interesting. So you don't have to do anything to your building, really, apart from, as I say, making sure that the basic services are in place for that to work. And if you're only looking to do some small-scale repairs, well, maybe 6 months of the year, that's something that you can think about doing. Because if you have a family of 4, that's 150 quid per night. That's not bad money. So that's something to think about as well. So those are kind of some of the uses that you can think about that aren't ecumenically based for churches. But I'm going to talk now about what to do and what not to do, because I think that's probably quite useful. So, embrace the non-believers. People who aren't immediately part of your congregation but who know the building. As I talked about before, your building is probably very well known, your church is very well known locally. There will be people who take an interest but who are a little bit nervous about stepping on any toes, but they will usually be the people who've got the most outrageous and most interesting ideas for your building. And I know that was the case in Lochgelly, where somebody outside the local congregation came forward and said, what about this? And of course everybody was horrified, and then they sort of thought, well, actually that works for us. Decide where your red line is. So there have been various approaches that I've talked you through, from kind of the Newhaven climbing centre, where you can't see anything of the inside, to the champing end of town, where really there's no alterations to the interior. but you as a group need to know where your red line is. So do you really want it to be necessary for the chancel to be seen at all times? Can you take out the pulpit? If somebody put toilets in your narthex, would you be outraged, or would you think that's a really good use of space? So you need to have a list of things that you really don't want to shift on, but things that there is some wiggle room in, and you can't not shift on everything. You can't. So start to be really much more pragmatic than you want to be at the start of the process. The sooner you can have those conversations, the better the brief you will give to your architect. That's really important. Keep calm and carry on. Whatever you do, things will have to change. Even if you decide to go down the non-interventionist route of the champing, somebody has to service that, and you have to arrange that locally. There will be changes that you don't want. Nobody wants to hear that. I'm a project manager, I'm allowed to tell you. There will be things you don't want to happen that will have to happen to make a building sustainable. But you have to embrace the change, and you have to understand for your building to have a future, it has to go through that process. And that kind of brings me on to my next point, which is agree a vision. Agree a vision. Sit down with the other people involved with your project, and each of you separately come up with 100 words to describe how you see the church ending up. This is an exercise I run all the time when I'm doing workshops. It's very enlightening to see the variation between what people's ideas are. And you think you've all been singing off the same hymn sheet. No, you have not. No, you have not. Until you get to that point where you have to write down in 100 words what it is that you think you're all trying to achieve. You don't know what it is. And then that means that when it comes to briefing an architect again, you're in no position to do it because you're all coming from different angles. You're not all singing, you're not all aiming towards the one goal. So agree that vision first off before you do anything. And then you'll be much more willing to make those compromises to make it happen, because you've all agreed that's what you want to happen in the end for that building. Take your time. We saw how Cottier's took 30 years to complete, and it is absolutely stunning. But as I've said, once your building is wind and water tight, if you can, slow down. Churches are really fantastic structures, but the vast majority have done the same thing for, 200, 300, 400 years. Coming to it fresh and thinking that you are going to know what's right for that building within 3 years or 4 years or even 5 years is a big ask. And it's not likely that you're going to get it right if you just go in straight away and say, yes, this is the right thing. Take that time to get to know the building and get to know how the community want to use the building, if at all possible. Try and get that phase 1 work done. And you will find that funders, in a lot of cases, are very sympathetic to that as an outcome. And that brings me to my final point. And this is the one I will rant about for days if you let me, because I've seen it happen so many times. Don't covet a Millennium Dome. Nobody needs a Millennium Dome. Your project does not need £7 million spent on it. It doesn't need £5 million spent on it. You don't want a heritage centre with a childcare operator and a cafe and an exhibition space and hot desking and an office and a retail offer. You don't need those things. What you need is a building that works locally. And it's very, very easy when you read the grant literature from our friends in Heritage Fund, and I always pick them out, which is a bit mean, but it refers specifically to them, to get carried away with thinking about what the right end use for your building is, because they want you to do a heritage interpretation plan and an activity plan, and you and your architect quite rightly say, well, to do those things we need extra spaces, we need other places. And to pay for those things, we're going to have to take out a loan. And to service that loan, we're going to have many more income-generating parts to the building. And suddenly you've got this mammoth behemoth, and this tiny little church is surrounded by all these weird little additions that have no reference to the original building or to the original idea of what it is. Okay? So you don't need that £5 million project. You have to grasp that. You need 300 grand to fix the roof and a really good business plan. For the most part. Now that changes dramatically if you have somebody coming in and saying, yes, I know exactly what we're going to do and I'm going to fund it all and this is how it's going to happen. But if you're not sure, do not get swayed by funders saying, oh, we'll look at an application for that. Yes, they will look at it and then they'll throw it away because it's completely unsustainable. I know of a national institution, who will remain nameless, who got a grant of 5.5 million from the Heritage Fund last year, which is almost unheard of in this day and age. And it was to redo a very large part of their building and provide all these kind of ancillary learning sort of services of it. And they were this close to saying yes to the grant, and then they had a trustees meeting and they thought, actually no, this is not what we want at all. They thought, as a group of volunteers, we cannot service this in a meaningful way to the quality we would want to achieve. This is not our end goal. And then they spent about a year unpicking how they got to that point of thinking that was the only way that they could see their vision through. And so why did that happen at the start? Well, it happened because they didn't agree a vision, and they didn't stick to what that vision was and say, actually, no, we're going to say no to that 500,000 or 5.5 million, because where it takes us in the end is not something as a group that we're interested in pursuing. So bear that in mind. So that is an absolute whistle-stop tour. If you have any questions, I'll be delighted to take them. That's me. Thank you.